What we know from research is that 42% of principals indicated they were considering leaving their job. That comes from a joint study from NASSP and EPI. And Education Week just recently did a study where they surveyed teachers, and 92% of those teachers surveyed said that this year is actually more stressful than last year during COVID. So maybe it's time that we start thinking about de-implementation. Now, de-implementation comes from the medical field. About 7 or 8 months ago, I was talking with Aaron Hamilton from Cognition Education and John Hattie from the University of Melbourne, and they mentioned this topic of de-implementation, and after we got done talking, I just couldn't get it out of my mind. It was something that resonated with me so much that I actually put it in my book, Collective Leader Efficacy, Strengthening Instructional Leadership Teams, and it's becoming part of the work that I'm doing in coaching. So what I'd like to do in this video is split it up into 4 areas. The research, go over that really quick, and then a non-educational example of the parts of de-implementation, an educational example, and then my findings. If you like this video at the end, please consider giving it a like and even follow the channel because I upload videos from time to time focusing on all things education. So back to the research. Now, the de-implementation research from the medical field, there are 4 studies right now. And one of the best definitions is that de-implementation is the abandoning of existing low-value practices. And it comes down to 4 areas: a partial reduction, a complete reversal, a substitution with a related replacement, and a substitution with an unrelated replacement. So I feel like if they can do it in the medical field, then we certainly should be able to do it in education. But what I like about the definition that I chose, that abandoning of existing low-value practices, there's something there to actually explore too. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the findings. Let's go with some fun non-educational examples. So partial reduction might be, say you drink a little bit too much white wine, and you've decided that a partial reduction would be going from 3 glasses down to 2. A complete reversal would be where you just quit and go cold turkey. A substitution with a related replacement would be switching wine out with a non-alcoholic beer. And a substitution with an unrelated replacement would be you get rid of the wine and you pick up frozen yogurt instead. But when it comes to educational examples, this has been an interesting part because this has been a conversation. I use Mentimeter and ask open-ended questions during in-person workshops, remote workshops, and also in my coaching sessions. And when it comes to a partial reduction, there are a few things that really stick out. Number 1 is meetings. People talk about the fact that they just have too many meetings, and sometimes they're talking about the same thing at several different meeting spaces. Now, when you look at that, you might say that's kind of surface level, right? Because remember that the original definition is abandoning existing low-value practices, which means you actually have to have evidence to see that those practices you're abandoning are really impactful. And it's not just about the practices that you don't like, it's about the ones you like too. But one of the ones that came up for teachers was assessments. They feel like they overly assess students. So partial reduction would be not assessing as much, and that gives you the sort of the ability and the opportunity to actually go in and check the assessments that you do use and use them for formative assessment, and to use them to guide your teaching. Now, when it comes to a complete reversal, you might look at something like deficit mindset for a growth mindset. Deficit mindsets abound these days because of what we have been referring to as COVID learning loss. And it's not that COVID learning loss is not a real thing, but sometimes I worry that we're going to create a generation of victims if we look at them through this lens of the fact that they didn't learn as much as everybody else did at that point in time. I'm a former struggling learner who repeated 4th grade and barely graduated from high school. There were plenty of years I didn't have quality learning or didn't partake in it, but I ended up with 2 master's degrees and a doctorate. So, we have to check our mindset a little bit. It might even be something like worksheets. We replace worksheets and we actually, replace them with more cooperative learning or something like that. And then when we look at a substitution with a related replacement, we can once again look to meetings, because quite honestly, a lot of staff meetings, people will say they want to get rid of staff meetings. Why not substitute it with a related replacement, which would mean that maybe you substitute it with flipped faculty meetings. So you get together with your instructional leadership team. This is what I talk about in the Collective Leader Efficacy book. And you actually, send out an article or a blog or a video dedicated to that learning space. And then at the faculty meeting, you engage in cooperative learning among staff where they look at evidence of how they put it into practice. That is a substitution with a related replacement. When it comes to a substitution with an unrelated replacement, it's been really interesting because I work with all the ULIT K2 coaches from New York City, and they're a wonderful group, and they've talked about the fact that they want to substitute with an unrelated replacement when it comes to using running records, because the science of reading does not actually support using running records in K2. That's another video for another time, but what that means is we go back to that whole definition behind deimplementation, which is abandoning existing low-value practices, and we look at why are we engaging in these practices. In fact, in one of the webinars I was doing with the coaches, they really talked about this whole idea of substituting with more phonemic awareness and phonics as opposed to running records. And a few of the ULIT coaches actually said, but I like running records. And that's the thing that I want to segue into the findings. When I'm using Mentimeter and I have these open-ended questions, what I'm finding is that people have a tendency that when I ask them, what would you partially reduce? What would you get rid of? They actually talk about the things that they think are done to them, not the things within their own practices. And if we're going to go from surface to deep to transfer level learning with our own practices, and we look at meetings or we look at assessments, then what that means is that we have to look at our own practices and understand what is working and what is not. And it might mean that we need to get rid of things that we actually have liked doing over the years. The other thing that I think is important about the findings is that I think what makes deimplementation so difficult for people is that when you're a middle manager or when you're a teacher, you're actually afraid of getting rid of something because you are afraid you're going to get in trouble. Like the policies in our head. We do this because we're supposed to be doing it, when maybe that's not the case. And it wraps back around to that whole idea of abandoning existing low-value practices, because it means we need to engage in dialogue about what practices we can suspend. And the important thing here is that if we don't do that, then that 42% of principals, that 92% of teachers from earlier in this discussion, that might end up getting worse. I want us to be able to focus on well-being and mindsets and things like that, but it's more than breathing. It's about looking at our workload and understanding what we need to start to abandon. It's a very powerful topic that I'm going to be studying for months to come and maybe even years. So if you have some ideas, please feel free to put it in the comments section. But I want to thank you for watching, and once again, if you like the video, give it a like, and if you want to consider following this channel, please do, because I have other videos up here as well. Thank you for your time.